inviting us, for organizing this event, this seminar. I think it's a very exciting moment to be able to bring together different experts here, discuss a similar sort of issue by looking at coming from different points of view, and bringing in the great research that they've been doing recently. So again, as you mentioned in your introduction, this is a topic of large-scale events, mega events, specifically cultural events, that I've been studying now for many years. And the idea for this event came from another seminar that we participated in, where I presented some of that work. And I think the interesting thing about mega events, and especially in relation to urban design, is how they really are sort of this key moment to open up many possibilities, to really think about what cities can or should be. And often there are many examples where things don't necessarily go according to plan. And so I think today, looking at this idea of how events are evolving is quite critical. And so the more we can better understand what's happening from a planning point of view, from a policy point of view, and as well more larger trends and patterns that are emerging, help us to know what some of the potentialities of these events are, or really how can we begin to work with them in a way that's more effective, more sustainable, creates better places or spaces. So I'm very much interested to explore all of these issues here today with everyone more in detail. So a lot of my work, specifically with the HOMI project, has been focused very much on this intersection with the issues of heritage, with cultural heritage, built and intangible heritage, with heritage communities, identities, with the various actors in terms of governance, decision making. So from that project, which was a JPI cultural heritage funded project, we explored mainly capitals of culture, but also the expo across Europe, involving about 20 different researchers. And that ultimately led to, in 2021, the Charter for Mega Events in Heritage-Rich Cities. That we, at the beginning of the project, the impetus was really understanding that there was a sort of gap in policy, that these large events were happening, that they were happening often, at least cultural events in places of heritage, but there wasn't, say, strong sense of guidelines, recommendations of how to approach this. And so we, with the charter, were able to respond to that need. And we've since seen it put into action. So the planning of the Bergamo Brescia 2023 Italian Capital of Culture program was referencing our event, and also the ongoing planning of the Milan Cortina Olympics is also using that document, and we're seeing it, thankfully disseminated, communicated to different cities around Europe, who are currently, evaluating this, trying to understand how to use these events and in a way that creates better places and does not put their heritage at harm. So that's one small example of the many range of issues that these, by studying mega events, we're able to go very much in depth, and why they are so important. And the idea for today was to kind of give a bit of an overview to the audience, for why I wanted to bring together specifically these speakers was, if we look at the last 10 years, especially the Olympics. I think the Olympics is, quite perhaps the most notable mega event. It's usually one of the largest, it's perhaps the most visible. And really in the last decade, it's undergone massive, drastic transformation. So if we think back to, a year ago, 2013, we were, all sort of preparing, waiting, looking forward towards the Sochi Winter Olympics of 2014, which were the sort of largest or most expensive Olympics of all time. And so following also the London Olympics, Beijing, there were sort of these series of bigger and bigger Olympics. But since then, we've had a series of sort of smaller and smaller. We'll hear a lot more later today about the Olympic 2020 agenda from the IOC, which was shortly thereafter published to sort of, from a policy point of view, open up new approaches to thinking about or hosting the Olympics. We've seen in this time many cities cancel or turn away from their bids for various reasons. So also the perception or of what they're capable of, or perhaps the challenges, problems that these events bring has grown. We then saw with the pandemic in 2020, for the first time, these large-scale events being delayed, or then when they were carried out in the case of the Tokyo Olympics in 2021 without any audience. And so we've seen sort of unprecedented challenges and changes, and particularly upcoming in the next several years, sort of new experimentations between both Paris 2024 and the Milan Cortina 2026 Olympics, which are operating at very different scales and taking different approaches. So Paris using a lot more the public spaces of the city, using more temporary events. So we'll see that in the presentations probably a bit more this morning. And so from my research and experience, very interesting to see how the Olympics, at least in that case, are using the city in a much more similar way to many cultural events by really spreading out, using less grand infrastructure and more existing materials. So how these events start to interact spatially, the relationship they have with the city becomes very interesting, very important, because that dictates very much what they're capable of doing or how they can be planned, who can be involved. Also, are they, questions of sustainability and whether or not, it creates or generates more or less conflict. And then in the case of Milan Cortina 2026, as we'll see later, also in the later than in the presentation of Francesca, really this massive scale. So having events that are spread out between multiple host cities, regions, areas, and then the presence of natural, very fragile, sensitive natural heritage creates a brand, new issues to really have to think of, particularly when past events have not always been so sensitive or careful of some of these areas. And then finally, looking really at kind of this from the big picture, bigger perspective of these patterns, trying to understand, break them down. And we'll see finally the presentation of Martin Moore, and understand how we can begin to understand these or what might come from these, this sort of the idea of the peak event. And so I really wanted to bring together these three experts that I have thankfully the chance to know them and their work. From other events, presentations, collaborations. And so to really look at this topic, look at this issue that's quite pressing, that's still very much an open question. I don't see today as having answers about the future, defining exactly what mega events will look like, but a chance to start really discussing how some of these changes, issues are affecting different aspects, different components, different ways of seeing, thinking, and designing ultimately with mega events due to some of these factors. So just as a kind of broad picture overview of what how today was framed. And so I won't say too much more because I don't want to steal anything from the participants. So of course, our first presenter is already, as Marichela mentioned, is Gustavo Lopez dos Santos. So I give the floor back to you, Marichela, if you'd like to introduce him in his presentation.
Yes, thank you, Zachary, for this very interesting introduction. And now I will say some words about Gustavo Lopez dos Santos. He is currently a territorial engineering PhD candidate at Instituto Superior Técnico, University of Lisbon, since 2019. His scientific interest is in the study of the dynamic interrelationship between the city and mega events, regarding the planning, delivery, and the permanent and temporary effects in territories and communities. His dissertation is entitled Sustainable Urban Development and Mega Events, the Impacts of the Olympic Agenda 2020 and the Future Olympic Legacies. And in 2022, he was awarded with the PhD Students and Early Career Academics Research Grant Program of the Olympic Studies Center by the International Olympic Committee. So please, Gustavo.
I will try to share my screen now. Can you see the screen?
Yes, it's okay. Thank you.
And now in full screen, right?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Just give me a second to make sure I can see you. Yes. Okay. So thank you very much for your introduction. I just want to add to that introduction that I'm working in the Center for Innovation in Territory, Urbanism and Architecture in Instituto Superior Técnico, University of Lisbon. And I want to start by thanking you for this invitation, of course, and opportunity to share my work. I will talk to you about my project titled The Effect of Olympic Agenda 2020 on Urban Planning for Mega Events, assessing case studies of future Olympic Games and outlining new recommendations. So this is part of my thesis project, which I developed last year in 2022, during which I was a grant holder of the Olympic Studies Center PhD program. So to give you a bit of a context of my project, for decades, the Olympic Games have been used by host cities as a tool to boost the city's international profile, for place marketing and globalization, and large urban regeneration projects were carried out with the objective of transforming cities and attract capital. And hosting the Games worked also as a way to accelerate the implementation of certain urban projects, many of them that have been shelved for years for many different reasons. However, only recently, hosts started showing some awareness to align these Olympic projects with their own city plans and long-term development goals. And some of them have done it greatly and largely contributing for the city's development, even if some negative side effects always came attached. Differently, other hosts have been much less successful, and sustainability has been a key issue and a source of problems. Well, I believe that in the last presentation, Martin Muller will talk to you with more detail about this problem, so I'll not develop much here, but I can say that economic sustainability has been a problem due to the use of public budgets and incurring in huge opportunity costs, and with many sports facilities and other infrastructures built becoming white elephants, with high maintenance costs and without a post-games use. Regarding environmental sustainability, it has been worse in the past, I believe, and especially in the Winter Olympics. But since the 90s, there has been a significant increase of awareness about these issues. And also very important is social sustainability, as a lot of editions show problems regarding human rights and especially generating displacement of low-income communities. And for that reason, public opposition against the Games grew and global anti-Olympic movements rose. So nowadays, these contestation groups are highly organized and have been somewhat successful in highlighting the negative characteristics of the Games. And in a certain way, public opposition was responsible for a series of bid withdrawals, especially to host the editions of 2022 and 2024. And this is where Olympic Agenda appears, a policy published in December 2014, consisting of 40 recommendations to improve the credibility, sustainability, and youth appeal of the Games. And its motto is to change or to be changed. That is the question. And this is where my project is focused. So analyzing the implementation of this policy concerning issues related with urban planning and assuming from start that the recommendations are very hard to be implemented and might be inefficient regarding some issues, and thus they can be improved. So the point was to see what next host cities are doing to implement Olympic Agenda and identify any flaws and difficulties in this implementation to develop new recommendations to further enhance the agenda. So obviously this objective and methodology turns the research into a very critical analysis because it seeks for failures, things that are not good, and it somewhat ignores the achievements of Olympic Agenda. But as I will mention, I think Olympic Agenda is innovative, and I truly believe it is driving great and needed radical change. Well, we can always do better, right? So this is the methodology I followed. I will not bother you with this. I just want to tell you that it was divided in 3 parts, further divided in stages and guided by secondary research questions. So part 1 was a document analysis, part 2 was a case study analysis, and part 3 was research by design. In part 1.1, I wanted to understand what did the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, commit to do with this Olympic Agenda. And then I realized that Olympic agenda was only a policy positioned at a very strategic level of decision. It was kind of a vision. And then after Olympic agenda, the IOC developed many other guiding documents to implement the recommendations of Olympic agenda, which were positioned more in the tactical and operational levels of decision. And they also changed the regulations like host city contracts and also the Olympic Charter, the Code of Ethics. So I identified all these official documents that could have relation to urban planning. And I did use a specific methodology to select the documents, but I don't think it is relevant to mention. And with these documents selected, then I asked myself, how does all of this relate to the territory and to urban planning? And using a thematic analysis, I selected and collected information from all these documents to build what I called the urban-related reforms. So these reforms, they group all the strategies and actions by the IOC related with the same topic. So they are very objective and clear, and we can say something like the IOC wants to do specifically this and wants to do specifically that. And I grouped these reforms in also what I call the urban-related objectives. So they are broad urban planning objectives. 3 of them are indirect, that is, they don't have a direct impact on the territory, but have impact on other things that then have direct impacts on the territory, like governance, for example. And the other 2 are direct. And here we can see the 22 reforms that I came up with. So they are grouped in the 5 objectives. The 5 objectives are, as you can see, ensure best practices, improve the governance system, rely on specialized knowledge, contain urban-related costs, and enhance urban sustainability. And if we look, for example, here at contain urban-related costs, the reforms, they are about matters of the size of the Olympic Games, the locations of the venues, enabling to locate venues in different cities and so on. Venue sharing between multiple sports, the reduction of requirements, and service optimization, just to give you an example of what these reforms are. So with these reforms as an input, I wanted to check how are hosts not fulfilling these reforms. And I chose 2 future editions of the Games as case studies, Paris 2024 and Milan Cortina 2026. So again, the word not is here because of the methodology that I adopted and not because hosts are not implementing Olympic agenda or so. And I will show you now 2 very good examples of how hosts are fulfilling the commitments of Olympic agenda. So the first is about Paris 2024. What we can see in this chart is the number of new additional or planned venues in red and green. Here, temporary venues in pink and existing venues in blue. And the first 2 bars, they compare the Paris 2012 candidature, with which they didn't win, as you know, with Paris 2024 candidature. And we can see how they are using many more existing venues than they proposed previously and much less new venues. And moving forward in the chart, we see changes after they were awarded with the games. And we can see that they reduced the overall number of venues needed, and namely the temporary ones, saving some budget. And this is not even the final numbers, because since December 2020, they have changed more venues. So I don't know exactly how the numbers are as of now with the final concepts. I didn't do that analysis. So when we look at Milan Cortina 2026, the greatest innovation is probably the fact that it will be organized in many different cities, so at a macro-regional scale, instead of a single city. So we'll have competitions in Milan, some in Livigno and Bormio, other in Cortina, Predazzo, Tesero, etc. So in theory, this gives the opportunity of using more existing sports venues or facilities instead of wasting resources building new ones or temporary ones. So the objective of this stage was to basically generate hypotheses to build a research agenda regarding the implementation of Olympic agenda. And by hypothesis, what I mean is situations that I considered that maybe they were not aligned with the Olympic agenda reforms previously identified. So I could afterwards further analyze them in more detail. And I generated this hypothesis based on the information publicly available, like the candidature files. And then I followed updates on the preparations basically through online news. So I compared the case studies with the reforms and developed a research agenda made of 35 hypotheses to be further explored in the next stage. I will give you an example of two of them, hypothesis 9 for Paris 2024 and hypothesis 35 for Milan Cortina 2026. So hypothesis 9 is about the construction of a media village in Paris 2024 to accommodate members of the media and being built here in this red line. The green line is Parc Georges Valbon, which is a Natura 2000 protected area. There were some issues with the construction of this village because it is being built right next to a protected area, and actually to allow the village to be built, some urban planning regulations had to be changed and having some environmental impacts. But actually that is addressed in a different hypothesis, not this one. So this one is actually very simple. Here, the focus is on the reform resources, which has a specific part of the host city contract that says that provide a media village only in cases where the hotel infrastructure of the host city does not have sufficient capacity. And I must say that the word only was added to this document after Olympic Agenda. So it's an innovation of Olympic Agenda. And at the time I found out that at the beginning, the International Olympic Committee questioned the need to build a media village, saying that the hotel infrastructure of Paris was enough. And then with COVID and budget cuts, the media village has been reduced more than half, so proving that it was at least overdimensioned for the games. So I asked, why are they building a media village if they have enough hotels? And the hypothesis I built was the media village was not necessary for the games. When we look at hypothesis 35 about Milan Cortina 2026, it actually derives from what I presented previously as a good example of impacts of Olympic Agenda. So it has to do with the spatial scattering of venues. So initially, spreading the venues sounded to me like a very good innovation and a great way to save money, but also complicating processes related to transport, for example, and also governance, because there are a lot of entities and public administrations involved in these games. And then when I started looking into more detail to this case study, I realized that there were some location choices that for me didn't make much sense. For example, the venues in Cortina, which will be subject to significant construction works, could be easily replaced by existing venues that will not be used either in Milan or Bormio, as well as in Innsbruck in Austria. So, and the host city contract, it says that the IOC may allow the organization of entire sports or disciplines outside the host city or outside the host country, notably for reasons of legacy, sustainability, and cost efficiency. And I think there were more sustainable solutions. So the hypothesis I built was the concept of Milan Cortina is an overcomplication and not designed for reasons of legacy, sustainability, and cost efficiency. Okay, so then with these 35 hypotheses, it was time to understand why did hosts take certain decisions? Like, for example, why to build the media village in Paris if we have hotels? Why to spread the venues in Milan Cortina? So for that, I did field visits and the interviews. I visited more than 100 sites related with the two case studies. I was in Paris as well as in Milan and north of Italy in general. I produced two separate reports which describe these visits in detail. You can consult them online if you're interested. So in terms of interviews, I did 21 interviews with 26 people. Here they are organized by groups. In Group A, we see event organizers, in this case, the organizing committees. Group B are governmental entities with specific responsibilities within the games. Here you see local, municipal, and national governmental bodies. And finally, Group C and D are environmental associations and civic groups which oppose the games or specific games-related urban projects. So then I analyzed the interviews in order to validate the hypothesis. And I will tell you about the conclusions regarding the two examples that I gave you. previously. So first, about the Media Village for Paris 2024. I learned that the village was actually not needed, and that it was an option to simplify transport of the members of the media. And the organizers also considered that building a media village was a strength of Paris 2024 candidature, so they had to deliver it. And also environmental associations and civic groups know that this village was not needed and are absolutely convinced that the project derives from political ambitions and are worried about the environmental impacts and the gentrification effects it can cause. About hypothesis 35 regarding the spread of venues in Milan Cortina, it is actually a long story, which can be resumed as the following. 3 cities wanted to bid for the games, Turin, Milan, and Cortina. The Italian Olympic Committee said, yeah, great, can you join forces and build a candidature together? Turin said no, and voila, you have the final concept. So, which means that even if there are some great benefits of spreading the venues, in this particular case, it did not originate from the objective of making maximum use of existing facilities, but rather from the interest of both cities in hosting the Winter Olympics. And some less sustainable solutions were adopted because of this. Okay, so then I had 35 hypotheses and 35 answers to these hypotheses. So what I did was to extract from each hypothesis information and group it in what I considered to be situations that shared common ground. So in other words, situations that had similar decision-making, that are predicted to lead to similar outcomes, or that need to be addressed in similar ways. And this grouping, it resulted in what I called the glitches of Olympic agenda. I identified 10 glitches, and you can see that the examples that I showed, hypothesis 9 and 35, were used to build 4 of the glitches. I will go very briefly through all of them because I believe this is the actual contribution of my research. So the first one is about marketing versus sustainability. This has to do with the fact that even though organizers seek sustainability of the games, they are also aware that the games need to deliver a big show and showcase the city to the world. And for that, many times you either have to compromise sustainability or marketing. So this is a problem. The second one, participants' experience. This has to do with the athletes and media experience being put as a priority, which many times leads to solutions that could be much better from the sustainability point of view. Like, for example, do we really need to build Olympic villages and media villages of the sizes that we currently do? Or is it only to give athletes the best experience ever? So, the third one, political affairs. This one is very obvious. So political leaders do not want to host successful games. They might host successful games, but what they want is to fulfill their political agendas. And many times this leads to solutions that are not in the best interest of the games. The fourth, conceptual disconnection. This is about not all entities involved in the games being on the same page and with the same objectives. Also, not all of them have the necessary information and experience, especially when it comes to the local levels of decision. Olympic immunity. This is about the creation of Olympic laws that facilitate the organization of the games. So Olympic laws have always been very useful, but also very problematic. And the IOC, by allowing that hosts use the Olympic law for whatever they want, and to carry out constructions that were not previously presented and approved, facilitated by this law, and that are not considered necessary for the games, puts at risk the own Olympic brand, because in the end, if anything goes wrong, that construction was carried out in the name of the games and the games will be blamed for it. Abstractness. This is about the need to define terms when they are used in straightforward contexts to make decisions about planning. So what exactly is a legacy? What is viability of a plan? What is a sustainable long-term plan? So each person has a very different understanding of this. Olympic versus local needs. This is a difficult one to address. So basically, when building venues for the Olympics, we're saying that we are building venues for high-level athletes and that we will be able to make them suitable for local communities. But this is not always possible because professional sport has very different needs when compared to sports learning activities or amateur sport, and the facilities needed have very different scales. Detailed planning. So basically, Olympic Agenda tries to simplify some issues about planning, and it makes sense to simplify, but at what cost? So what I noticed was that for many situations, there was not a previous appropriate planning because since the implementation of Olympic Agenda, the IOC does not require such detailed planning anymore, and this can be a problem. Transparency and communication. I do believe that the IOC is more transparent in many issues since the implementation of Olympic Agenda, but when it comes to aspects at national, regional, or local scales, the transparency is as much as the transparency of governments, because local issues are not issues of the IOC, are issues of governments. But they are still issues of the Games, and they affect the Olympic brand. And so transparency and communication regarding Olympic projects is still lacking. And finally, public opposition. This is mostly, there is nothing about Olympic Agenda that shows some concern for local populations, which were the responsible for the several bid withdrawals in the last decade. Okay, I will not develop much further, but I just want to tell you that to answer these glitches in the final part of the methodology, I tried to answer the question, what can be done about this? And I developed 6 recommendations that I believe that can potentially contribute to help achieving the goals of Olympic Agenda and enhance the urban sustainability of the Olympic Games. 1, make the framework for the Olympic program context dependent. So this is basically to adapt the sports chosen to the host city. 2, review the participants' experience criteria to make them more compatible with the host city's urban resources. 3, improve planning to mitigate risks that compromise the urban sustainability of the Olympic Games and their legacies. 4, recognize the Olympic Games as a political instrument and formalize it accordingly. And 5, engage with local communities. And finally, the last recommendation is just a suggestion of a way to implement the previous ones. And these are actually only the titles of the recommendations. I did develop them with much more detail, but I don't think I have time to explain it to you now. So I think that the biggest conclusion we can take from this research is that Olympic Agenda is a great effort and is driving important changes regarding the urban sustainability of the Olympic Games. But at the same time, it is still not enough. And I just highlighted the reasons, some of the reasons that it is still not enough. And I guess this is it. Thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Okay, Gustavo, many thanks for your very interesting presentation. And now we will have the next one by Francesca Vigotti. She is an architect in 2013, Politecnico di Milano and Politecnico di Torino, and a PhD in Preservation of Architecture Heritage, 2018, Politecnico di Milano. Currently, she is a junior assistant professor in architecture preservation at the Politecnico di Milano, Department of Architecture and Urban Studies. Her research focuses on the role of widespread heritage as a resource to foster sustainable development, particularly in fragile contexts. So please, Francesca.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Thank you, Gustavo, for the brilliant presentation. I was really impressed. And so thank you all for having us today. I tried to share my full screen just to check if everything is fine. Okay. Could you still see everything? Okay.
Perfect. Thanks.
So, thank you very much. So my paper today, let's say my contribution today, will address some of the parts that were already treated by Gustavo, of course, because we will be talking about Milan Cortina 2026 Winter Games, but we will tackle it by the side of alpine landscape and built heritage. So, which is the impact of the possible impact of the Olympic Games and the mega events on this very fragile environment and heritage as well. So just 2 words. I hope you see the next slide. You are? Okay, perfect. Before introducing the table of contents, I want to address the fact that this research is a research in progress, that it's born in collaboration with Zachary. So I'm really glad that he invited me today. And so we are trying to, let's say, merge together our expertise in order to advance a little bit the contribution in literature regarding the challenges between mega events and heritage itself. And also this is part of a didactic experience I am holding as professor this year at Politecnico di Milano at the AUIC school, especially on the case study of Valtellina and Bormio. So at first we will see which is the intersection briefly, which is the intersection between landscape heritage and mega events, and then pass through the cultural landscape heritage within the Milano Cortina 2026 Winter Olympic Games. What are the challenges facing alpine heritage in this context? And it's very interesting that Gustavo addressed it. We have tried to reflect on the legacy, and the term legacy, of the 1956 Cortina Winter Olympics, and the fact that the Winter Olympics will return, at least in part, 70 years later in the same location. And some final remarks on advancing landscape heritage values within the mega events and the Olympic Winter Games. So which are the emerging Olympic trends? The presentation before already presented it quite well. I will just go very briefly about it. The first one is the reuse, in a way, of existing urban spaces in Paris 2024, but also, in fact, in Milan Cortina 2026. But as Gustavo was pointed out before, the major, let's say, innovation in Milan Cortina 2026 is an increased territorial inclusion and the spreading of the games in different locations and in 3 different regions of Italy: Lombardy, Trentino Alto Adige, and Veneto. So we see some of the location as described before. So we will have Milano, which is the core, let's say, of Lombardy region, and then we have other spots in the Lombardy region, the Valtellina cluster, so Livigno and Bormio at the border with Switzerland. Then we have Pedrazzo and Tesero in Trentino Alto Adige, and of course Cortina in Veneto. But apart from that, which are the venues, let's say, and the hosting of the opening and the medal plazas of events, there are other parts of the regions that are involved with heritage, that are combined and will host part of the Olympic Games. So don't be scared by the wall of words here, but I wanted to highlight some of the passages that are related to heritage in the binding dossier of Milan Cortina 2026. So of course, there is some reflection and some references to the fact that there is a world-class venues, and the fact that there is excitement of a modern metropolis and the thrill of the traditional Italian setting. And there is the first address and the first reference to UNESCO historic cities. So heritage comes under the spotlight in this sense, and under the fact that it's let's say highlighted the fact that there is a World Heritage properties that will be very close to the venues of the games. Then the fact of the medal ceremonies, and I'm using the words again of the bidding dossier. Of course, there is the Piazza Duomo, and the bidding dossier adheres is an iconic location in Milano historical, and the sublime backdrop of the Dolomites in Cortina. So the fact that in a certain way heritage in the sense is claimed as a sort of backdrop, a scenography in a way of the events of the Winter Games. Again, the fact that there is another specifically to the beauty of Cortina and the natural environment and the jagged peaks, and again, Dolomites offer a unique backdrop to hosting the games. So again, sort of natural amphitheater, this definition of heritage as a backdrop. And as I said before, the fact that there is an address to UNESCO World Heritage Cities, which are located in the host regions, so in Lombardy, in Veneto, and in Trentino Alto Adige. So we have a reference to Venezia, Verona, and Venice, Verona, and Padua, or also not to art cities like Bergamo and Mantova, or also to natural heritage or assets like the three lakes, Lago Maggiore, Lago di Garda, and Lago di Seo, and again, the mountains from Valtellina to the Dolomites, and again, the fact that there is an extraordinary backdrop provided by the city of Milano and the Italian Alps, adding value in a way, to the experience, let's say, of the games. And the fact that, of course, there was a specific choice related to the opening and the closing ceremony. While the opening ceremony will be at the Stadio Meazza in Milan, the closing ceremony will be in Verona, in Amphitheater the Arena of Verona. And one of the, citing again the bidding dossier, best preserved and iconic amphitheaters. And the fact that, of course, we will be back to Milan. The two, let's say, medal plazas will be the Cathedral Square in Milano, Piazza del Duomo, in the core, in the very core center of Milan, and the Olympic Stadium in Cortina. So these are referred as quintessential Italian location that will provide an inspirational stage to welcome the Olympic and Paralympic medals. But what's more behind it? So here I'll try to map in a way which are the World Heritage properties set in the three regions of that will be host Milano Cortina 2026. And in this map you will see highlighted the ones underlined, let's say, the ones that are more related, let's say, to the medal plazas, the Olympic venues, and where the games will be held. And so, again, citing the bidding dossier, 17 UNESCO heritage sites to be visited in the Olympic host region. So we will have in the center of Milan, so nearby, let's say, the Duomo Cathedral and Duomo Plaza, the Church and Dominican Convent on Santa Maria delle Grazie with the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. Then we have the city of Verona that will host, as we say, the closing ceremonies, and of course the Dolomites. But you see that let's say, the spread of UNESCO World Heritage properties in the three regions is quite dense, and this is one of the let's say leverage of which over which the dossier makes a sort of strength for the dossier itself. So the rich heritage of the sites and of the regions. Of course, I will just to have some images about, of course, the arena in Verona, and then we have the Dolomites in Veneto region, and which are World Heritage properties inscribed in 2009, and you see Cortina is inside one of the clusters, let's say, of the Dolomite, one of the 9 Dolomites groups. And so we will try to understand how this kind of natural heritage, which is very, very fragile, will be tackled by the Olympic Games. Again, which are the environmental, social, and conservation issues for alpine heritage? So first of all, the fact that the consideration for landscape heritage has expanded drastically in very recent years, and there are many projects to protect, revitalize, and regenerate the alpine macroregion, which is facing ongoing challenges and difficulties under some different point of views. There are many potential links between these aims and the presence of the Olympic Games, which can be taken into consideration throughout planning and implementation phases. The 2026 dossier largely frames alpine region heritage as a potential tourist attraction. And this is one of, let's say, the most important things that we have to keep in mind during the presentation itself. The widespread heritage of Milano Cortina 2026, I will do a brief focus on Valtellina, which is one of the, let's say, clusters Games in 2026, but it's also one of our main case study, both for the research and for the didactic activities. So you see here, I just tried to map the opening closing ceremony location, the medal plazas and the competition venues in Lombardy and Veneto. So you see Milan, Verona and Cortina, and the cluster of Valtellina. So we are in the northern part of the Lombardy region, in the province of Sondrio, which is the capital town of the province. And we will have the two venues of Livigno and Bormio. Here I highlighted also the city of Tirano, which is part of the Valtellina Valley, because it's part of one of the sites that we saw before, the UNESCO heritage properties we saw before. The Haitian railway in the Albula and Bernina landscapes is one of those. A focus on Valtellina, specifically on the city of Bormio. You see, Bormio is quite a small city with quite a few inhabitants, let's say, but it will play a major role in the venue as one of the main venues, let's say, will hosting the games. It is a very interesting core historical center, and in the years of the edificatory boom right after the Second World War and the increasing of let's say the tourism attraction in relation to winter sport, it has spread on outside the city center, and it has seen an edificatory boom in the last, let's say, 50, 60 years. So this is an overview of Bormio, just to give everyone a glimpse on the city. And this is part of the built and historical heritage of the city center, the natural heritage, of course, of the city center of Bormio. It's, as I say, a fragile environment, which is facing a lot of issues which are common to the very similar, let's say, mountain location in the Alps, but not only in the Alps. So it's facing some parts the population. It has still a good economic growth, but it's facing, of course, the problem of climate change, which is also related to the fact that the main economy of Bormio is related to winter sports. So we will see how climate change and the fact that the snow is disappearing will affect, in a way, also the economy and the heritage of Bormio. You see here some of the spots, let's say, of the cluster of the city center. And you see also one of the main facilities in relation to winter sports, so the Pista Stelvio, and also the other winter facilities. These pictures were taken in March, in the beginning of March, and you see that the snow was start lacking in a way. So we had an exceptionally warm winter this year, but you see some of the facilities which are still in operation, but we will have to question about climate change in relation also to the winter sports and the Winter Olympics, of course. Then there are some other issues that we will see afterwards, but are strongly related to some of the pressure that is really, let's say, peculiar location are facing, which is the edificatory boom and the phenomena of second homes, for example. So the fact that you see it in the picture, most of the most recent construction in Bormio are related to short-term staying, and of course second homes. So let's say the new spread of edifices is related mainly to this kind of function. So coming back to which are in general, and then some of the, let's say, problems and issues and critical aspects that I explained you through the case of Bormio. There is, of course, a problem of demographic degrowth related to the lack of access to basic services, namely sanitary access and mobility and education, as for example. There is, of course, a problem related to soil consumption related to the phenomena of the second domes and to the edificatory boom. There is, of course, also related to the first one, an abandonment of built heritage, which is considerable unsuitable for short-term stays and which is requiring specific maintenance. Of course, this is all related to the fact that the edificatory boom has started in the second half of the 20th century, that has profoundly altered the historical landscape of the Italian Alps. The local construction as well underwent substantial intervention, transforming significantly the external appearance and the structure of the edifices, and many structures related to winter sport and tourism ultimately go unused, negatively impacting the landscape while not even in operation. So these are the three, let's say, main issues related to built and landscape heritage while we were taking the fact of winter sports and winter Olympics in general. So the legacy of the Cortina 1956 Winter Games, 70 years later, the Olympics will return, at least in part, to the same venues and embrace other areas that have already hosted the other national and international sporting events. Cortina is one of those. And we wanted just to underline the fact that in the 1956 dossier, there was a note about the significant number of intervention on the landscape needed to accommodate the event. For example, the important excavation and forestation to design the new sky runs. While, for example, the newly built facilities were constructed, like, for example, the Ice Stadium, in accordance with the requirements of the so-called Fine Art Commission at the time. One important thing is that the dossier of Cortina 1956 notes the decision to accommodate visitors in existing hosting facilities, so to avoid, let's say, the construction of new residential complex or Olympic village. So we are trying, and Gustavo was highlighted it very well in his presentation before, the fact that in this sense, this is a legacy that we don't have to forget in a way also while speaking about preparing, let's say, the dossiers. So some of the effects, of course, of the post mega event of 1956, of course, there are almost 70 years from the, let's say, the picture of 1956 then to the picture on 2019. But you see, of course, that there was a huge expansion of the built environment in the valley and a huge expansion of the built environment and the sky runs in Cortina. So the, let's say, the environment of Cortina itself has already changed a lot in respect of the last years. And it's not everything given by the Olympic Games of 1956, of course, but it's given to the fact that Cortina has become one of the most renowned tourist attraction destination for winter sports in Italy in the years afterwards, let's say the Olympic Games. So again, you see how much the Cortina environment has changed in the last 70 years, and some of the comparison between which were the facilities that were built specifically for the Olympics of 1956. So, for example, there's no stadium and the Italian sky jump, and how about it is the Italian sky jump in 2019. So some concluding remarks about my contribution. Of course, the 2026 Olympics can represent a potential turning point for a greater usage of cultural or landscape heritage within mega events. But of course, we have to question the sustainability of this kind of decision, and we have to question how heritage will be addressed and involved and carried off during the mega events. Of course, we have to take care of the fact that the 1956 experience should caution us about the post-event growth booms and the need to include local residents more in decision-making. And finally, the need for a more careful reflection and research on the role of landscape and built heritage in mega events. And I thank you very much. And this is my email if you want to keep it in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca, for this very interesting presentation. We will have the discussion at the end, so I go on to Martin Müller. He is a professor at the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. He is a human geographer working on the unsustainability of mega events, such as the Olympic Games and Football World Cups. He has established the world's largest database on the sustainability and outcomes of the Olympics and the World Cup since 1960. His most influential publications include an evaluation of the sustainability of the Olympic Games, Nature Sustainability. And if you want to find something more, you can go on the website www.martinmuller.net. So please, Martin.
Thank you very much, Marichela, for this kind introduction, and to Zach for putting us together. I knew of everybody else's work, but we've never actually met. So I'm very happy to have this conversation going. Marichela mentioned the database that we've been working on with my team over the past couple of years. And that database on mega events is actually also at the basis of what I'm going to present today. And so when I say team, although my name is on the program, there's a number of other people who have contributed to this and whose names you see there, and whose work I would like to acknowledge, because otherwise this this is not something I could have done myself. Let me just readjust the share screen because there has been an issue here. Just give me a second. My PowerPoint for some reason is acting up, but it'll just take a second, no worries. Slideshow, here we go. Okay. Yep. Okay, thank you very much. Now I'm back again. So with big events, there are a few things that we take for granted. That's why we call them mega events. One is that they're big. The second is that they grow even bigger. So we are used to, each event posting new records about how they have more participants, how they've become more expensive. So there's this implicit idea of growth that is inherent to those events, and that they will continue to grow even bigger in the future. And so this is something that is encapsulated in this quote here, that really takes issue with that fact and says, we really have too many events, too many tournaments, and above all, I dare say, too many championships. We see championships everywhere, and they multiply ad infinitum. Now, this is a very apt diagnosis of what's going on today, with a slight twist that this was a diagnosis by Pierre de Coubertin a little more than 100 years ago in 1911. So there are many events, nothing new, but since 1911, actually, we've had many more events than Pierre de Coubertin could ever have dreamt of. I think he was feeling like, that this will gradually get fewer and that all of those will survive. Most of the events that were founded during his period did survive. And so in my team, we compiled this graph, which goes back to the 1890s until today, by decades, and which looks at the new events, big mega events that have been founded in each decade and that continue to exist until today. And you see, it starts slowly in the 1890s, in the 1900s, 1910s. But then there's a real boom after the Second World War, where in the 50s, we see 50 new events. Those are usually annual, biannual, quadrannual events like the Olympic Games that come into existence. And you can also see that there's this strong link to modernity and Western modernity and the innovations or the convenience of Western modernity. It started with ocean liners in the 1890s, which provided a way for people to actually get together around the world. And then the evolution of media, radio, cinema, television, and then jet travel, which really sped up the possibility of even now visitors coming to those events and not just the athletes that were competing. And then with globalization, internet and mobile data, this really made it possible to spread any kind of TV transmission to the furthest corners of the planet. What we might be seeing is gradually a slowdown there in the 2000s. That's a speculation, but at least we don't see quite the same growth rates as before. So one could assume that that growth will continue like this in the future, but I think we're seeing increasingly signs of a crisis brewing for mega events, and signs that are very hard to ignore. There are two groups of factors that I'd like to highlight. One is societal factors, and the others are really more specifically related to events. On the societal side, we see a low carbon and a degrowth transition. Two elements that are not exactly conducive to how mega events are organized today, because they are high carbon events, and they are based on a growth logic, especially considering the sponsorship and the money that's coming in, where there's expectation that with each cycle, this will continue to grow. They're changing consumption practices. We no longer have kind of the standardized mass spectacle of large events that people watch on TV, but increasingly we have individualized consumption, video on demand. We also have the idea that consumers want something of a la carte experience. So no longer the standardized transmission of big games, but in particular for a younger generation, viewers are becoming accustomed really to an anywhere, anything, anytime model of individualized media consumption. And that is also posing a challenge to the model of those events. And of course, with the pandemic, what's been called into everybody's consciousness is the fact that these mass gatherings of people also are potential spreaders of viruses. It's always been like that, but I think Corona just made it very clear that this is and can be a major issue that needs to be addressed. So those are the elements that are, in a sense, putting a brake on growth in many ways. There are also specific event-related factors. One is something that Gustavo mentioned in his presentation, which is the increasing awareness of both cities and the citizens of cities of the costs that come with those games. And they are becoming more aware, more astute about assessing this cost-benefit equation that is behind those games. And this has resulted also in this globalization of public skepticism towards the event. So we have seen also not just the globalization of events, but the globalization of resistance to those events that has killed quite a number of bids, as Gustavo has shown. And finally, there is increasingly a feeling within the sports market that the trees don't grow up until they reach the sky, but that there is a limit to how much content one can offer and to how much content people will be able to consume and to be able to pay for in the end. So we're seeing much more and more market saturation. And so for us, those elements really were a reason to have a look at, how has the size of those events.
Je prépare le déj. Je vais parler d'ici un quart d'heure ou 20 minutes.
Merci. I think there are some side comments. Somebody had not muted the microphone.
No worry, I think was at the microphone.
Okay, thanks. So, we looked around and we were actually surprised to not find a systematic study on those growth aspects. So what we did is we came up with our own model of the size of a mega event. And we looked really at those 5 dimensions here of that you can see there. The sports dimension, there was a media dimension, a spectator dimension, a marketing dimension, and a cost dimension. We could have added an urban dimension, and I mean, I'm based on urban geography, and although what I'm presenting is not particularly urban today, we looked at that possibility, so something like a territorial footprint, but this was something that was relatively complicated to do, but which we're looking at doing in the future on our side. So I mentioned those 5 dimensions covering different aspects of size, because when we say the Olympic Games are growing, well, I think we need to be clear about what aspect they are growing in particular. with 2 to 3 indicators, and a way of comparing different Olympic Games or different mega events for us was to index each of those indicators to 1 for the first period that we looked at, and then we can compare those different units that we have also for these indicators, because sometimes we are counting people, at other times we are counting money. So this is a way of really compiling those indicators together into an overarching indicator. We looked at the Olympic Games and the World Cups between 1964 and 2018. At the moment, we're looking at updating this for the Paris Olympic Games, which will take us all the way through to 2024, at least with the information that is available. And so that at the moment, for us, this means that there are 43 events in total. And we work with a wide range of sources to find those indicators, starting from official reports from the IOC, FIFA, governments, audit offices, third parties. Depends a little on the country which of those sources was more relevant. Media in a second instance, because media reports tend to be a little less reliable. And of course, the colleagues of us that have worked on this before. And so this approach for the first time actually allowed us to identify which were the largest events worldwide in those categories, because the people are always saying, well, I don't know, the Sochi Olympics were really big, or the Tokyo Olympics were really big. So we actually now have a number of indicators to see how big they were in comparison to others. So we were able to say, okay, which were the largest events in the world in each of those categories. So on the left-hand side, you find the Summer Olympics in London. And you can see that for the Summer Olympics London, for most of the indicators, they reached the maximum value in our sample for the Summer Olympic Games. So the maximum value has been set by 2012 London for most of those indicators, not for all. So there were Summer Games that had more media representatives. There were in particular Summer Games that were much more costly than the London Olympic Games, and that had higher revenues as well. So this is a way really of comparing the size of each event to the maximum. You could also calculate the mean here if that is of interest. We can do a similar thing for Sochi, which was the largest Winter Olympic Games in our sample. And you can see that it was actually relatively small compared to many of the other events that we had in our sample, but it had by far the highest cost of venues, with those close to 13 billion only for the cost of venues, plus then other ancillary costs as well. And one can see also the largest World Cup in the World Cup series, which was the 2018 Russia World Cup. So we didn't have Qatar yet in the sample, where you can see that in particular in the broadcast revenue, the World Cup actually beats the Summer Olympics and the Winter Olympics. Whereas for the other, many of the other dimensions, it's actually a relatively small event still in comparison to the Olympic Games, in particular in comparison to the Summer Olympic Games. So, I mean, this gives us some sense of the fact that different events are big or mega in different ways and in different dimensions. And I think that's very important, in particular, when we want to also think about the urban impacts, because, you know, the urban impacts will be driven by, in particular, you know, how much money is spent on the venues, because this is, you know, those are shovels in the ground, a concrete poured. It will perhaps be less determined by sponsorship revenue or broadcast revenue, for example. Ticketing revenue also has an impact because often it's linked to the size of the stadia as well. And then, of course, also the number of people who are coming will also have an impact on the urban infrastructure that one needs to provide. So with our data set, what we're also able to do is to go back in time and see how those events have grown over time, from the 1960s to almost today. And on one thing we found is, you know, we did this graph and we had those 5 different colors that you can see here that show the costs, the marketing income, spectator size, media size, and sports size. And we did that for the Summer Olympics and for the Winter Olympics. And so each of the Olympics, and I know it's getting small here, but it's because there are really a number of events here on this graph. Each of those Olympics gets a column in this graph. And what one can see straight away is actually that the largest events are not the most recent ones. So both for the Summer Olympics and for the Winter Olympics, there has been a drop from here 2012 London to Rio de Janeiro 2016, and from the Winter Olympics in Sochi to those in Pyeongchang. And for Pyeongchang, it even dropped below the size of the Vancouver Olympics in 2010. So the largest events are, the latest events are not the largest ones. And what we were able to do then, in order to compare the overall size, taking all indicators into account, we calculated this mega event growth index. So it stands at 54 for London 2012. This means that London 2012 is 54 times larger than the first event in our sample, which are the Tokyo Summer Olympics. And it stands at 252 almost for the Sochi Olympics. So 252 times larger than the Innsbruck Winter Olympics in 64. So this, where it shows that, yes, there's been strong overall growth, but the Winter Games have grown much more strongly than the Summer Games as well. So this is something that we were not aware of, actually, because, I mean, the one thing we remember is the Winter Games in absolute terms are much smaller than the Summer Games, but they've grown much more, in particular, as you can see here, in the marketing revenue dimension. I mean, the revenue dimension really dwarfs the growth of any of the other dimensions here, also of the cost dimension. So this very persuasively shows that those events have become enormously profitable to the International Olympic Committee and the FIFA for the World Cup. And there's hardly any growth in the sports dimension. It's even that small that you can't see it here. But the sports dimension has roughly doubled the sports size of those events in the space of those years, whereas the marketing dimension has increased, several dozen times in the same time. Perhaps going shortly over to the World Cup, which we do not talk so much about in general, because it's it has less concentrated urban impact, but it's more dispersed. But it has had a much stronger growth than the Summer Olympics, actually. And particularly, you can see that the growth only started really in the 2000s with the Japan and South Korea World Cup here. And the difference to the Olympics is that the latest event is the largest. So the Russian World Cup in 2018 was still a little bit larger, actually, than the Brazil one. So what this data shows is that the World Cup is on something like a delayed growth path in comparison to Olympic Games. So it started to grow later, and it still is growing much more quickly than the Olympics, both summer and winter. So what we did with this data, we tried to create a model of how the growth path of those events has looked like over the past decades. Why not we find something of like a warm-up phase in the 1960s, 1970s, where there's steady growth across all dimensions, but not particularly strong growth, at least not compared to the next phase, which is the spurt phase there in the 1980s, 1990s, where there's really explosive growth, particularly in the marketing dimensions. So new marketing sources are being tapped. So those events become much more commercial as well, which also shows in the urban space, because the logos of the sponsors are, of course, much more present as well. Then we're entering a consolidation phase, which for the Olympics starts around the 2000s, 2010s, with decreasing growth. And then in the past couple of years, I talked about this crisis. We are in a crisis phase where, for the Olympics at least, we're seeing a plateau. In particular, also when we look at the Olympic Games that we don't have in our sample, the Tokyo Olympics and the Paris Olympics. The Tokyo Olympics, not by design, but by necessity with the Corona pandemic, of course, were much smaller in terms of the number of visitors that went there, right? So there has been an element of shrinkage that was imposed. And the Paris Olympics, and Gustavo mentioned some of this, have a very active policy actually of trying to reduce some of that size elements by reusing existing infrastructure, but also by decreasing the carbon footprint. So for us, we call this the peak event. We've reached the largest size probably of the Olympic Games, and the sizes, stabilizing or declining. And now there are a couple of scenarios that could fall in this post-peak phase. One would be something of seeing a decline because there's lots of pressure and external circumstances that make the size diminish. But then there could be a rebound as the external situation changes. There could be a much more rapid decline, imposed perhaps by a carbon-constrained world, by escalating costs, by perhaps also an interest of hosts to organize those games. This could really see a relatively rapid shrinkage of the size of those games. And finally, we could just be seeing a plateau actually. And in this case, we would not be a peak event, but it's just like a sort of a breather before growth really resumes and continues. So in any case, this crisis moment, as is the case with crises in general, is always a sort of a bifurcation moment, a moment of uncertainty. But certainly we can say that with the sustainability transition in front of us, Western modernity is experiencing a larger crisis. I think we're learning probably the hard way that mass consumption, mass production is not a model that is sustainable in the future. And that's something that also will force mega events to change because they are kind of a child of modernity, as I've shown with the first chart. There's the climate crisis issue. There's this globalization of resistance against major events. There's also this effective recoding of events, where increasingly people are aware that if they're mingling with lots of other people, there's not just joy and exuberance, but there's also fear, actually, of catching germs. So it's no longer this unadulterated joy that those events used to be. And we've seen that the economic situation is changing with increasing competition and market saturation. Where does this lead us? Does that put a question mark on the future of the Olympic Games? Well, I think there is no question that there is a need for some shrinkage or some degrowth. I think Paris is the Olympic agenda is basically saying this without using the term degrowth. Paris, I think, is reading the signs of our times by promising a carbon footprint that is cut in half. Let's see whether they are actually credibly able to do this. The other more general question is, the Olympic Games have been in existence for a very long time. They've been there for 120 years, which today is an extremely long time. So most big companies today exist for an average of 30, 40, 50 years. So most companies that were founded as the Olympic Games in 1896 are no longer around today. So that makes the Olympic Games exceptional. They have exceptional longevity. And the question is that because they're extremely well managed? They're always able to adapt to changes. They are extremely nimble and have a governance structure that is able to do that. Or have they just been very lucky, actually, in the context? And might they actually be much more vulnerable to disappearing than we think? This is a kind of the speculative conclusion here. But I think to bring this back also to the question of urban design, it is clear that bigger is better is no longer an option, and that this path towards degrowth that the Olympic Games have started definitely needs to continue. So I'm wrapping up here. You can read up on some of this, just appeared in a journal in tourism management. And there's also a data set that you can download and work with and play with that accompanies this analysis here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Martin. So very, very interesting, your presentation, all the seminar in the whole. So I'd like to open the discussion. I don't know if someone of the people who are attending want to ask something. If not, I have some question for all. So,
I also have some, so we'll see. I see we have a lot of experts in the audience, so very happy to also, I'm